Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Roland Zenology Pro tutorial. Today we're going to be having a look at the low frequency oscillator, or LFO. Just before we set off, if I can point you at the Patreon link down below, or alternatively the join button to become a YouTube channel member, those are two awesome ways to help support me, help me carry on making content like this. And we've already seen a couple of examples of the LFO in use. We've mapped it to the amplitude curve to get tremolo, or volume increase and decrease. And we've also mapped it to the pitch modulation to get vibrato. Again, these are very extreme examples of both of those things, basically turn them both up to maximum. But in reality, we dial in far more subtle effects to obtain. If we wanted to obtain a vibrato, then with a combination of rate and depth, we can get something that's much more pleasant. And in fact, in this synthesizer, it's a very sensitive LFO, and I'm just holding the shift key down now so that I can increment in individual values. And you'll find a setting of 3, 4, or 5 is going to give you a really nice, very gentle vibrato. Control click, set that back to 0. Okay, let's start with the visual edit page and figure out what's going on over here. We've got two separate LFOs, but they're absolutely identical. So everything that I'm going to talk about with respect to LFO 1 is going to apply equally to the second one. They're just completely independent oscillators. So the first one, we've got key trigger. What this means, I'm going to use pitch for the majority of these demonstrations because it's so easy to identify. What key trigger means is that every time I hit a key, the oscillator is going to start its period exactly here. So you're always going to hear an uptick. We'll put an asterisk in that. There's an option to change that later, but just for now. So every time I hit a key, it always starts on the uptick. If I slow it right down, you can hear that. If I disable the key trigger, that basically means that the LFO is now completely independent of any key press, which means that when I press a key press, if I press it fast enough, I'm going to be able to basically redraw that LFO curve. Because every time I press the key, I'm just basically jumping on this moving train at some point in the cycle. I'm going to leave key trigger on for the most part because it's more consistent, it's more reliable for demonstration purposes. Where we've got tempo sync, which allows us to set the LFO to whatever the host BPM is. At the moment we're set to 80. It's pretty straightforward. Then we get to the 3 time controls. Delay time is relatively straightforward. It means that from the moment I press a key, the synthesizer starts counting an amount of time before it implements the LFO. So if I bring a little bit of delay time in, you can see that static part of the LFO being introduced. And you can hear the moment that time period has elapsed, it immediately starts oscillating. And then from that point onwards, it's going to go up and down. Now that's a very unnatural and jarring effect. And so with delay time, we typically also implement a fade time to take away the brutality of this point here, where the LFO starts oscillating. What fade time does is mitigates that, smooths the effect from nothing to something. Now this is a great tool for implementing real-world effects. Very often, vocalists, saxophonists, guitarists, all sorts of musicians will hold a static note for a period of time and then begin to oscillate with their vibrato. It's a really lovely effect, and it's used so often that it's been modeled in this synth. So you can hear the chord being held static and then just very slowly start to oscillate. And you can even see it in the oscilloscope. You get the static wave, and then it begins to jiggle very gently from left to right as the pitch is modulated. Offset moves the entire LFO curve up or down on the y-axis. Now, this is a little bit difficult to rationalize in the context of pitch. What I'll do firstly is just bring this up a bit, and I'm going to press a C. And now you can hear everything that's oscillating is above C. So the center point around which the oscillation is occurring is different from the original static note. That doesn't make a lot of sense in the case of pitch, and it's not something that I would be looking to use offset for. But a good use case for offset is when we're looking at amplitude. Okay, so I've just dialed in the simplest possible amplitude curve to represent this. I've basically got a totally flat line maximum amplitude curve now, and you'll see the volume hit maximum, and it only goes down every time it hits the maximum. There's a little bit of modulation on the filter here, but you can see it hitting the ceiling and then coming down, and hitting the ceiling and then coming down. We pull the offset away. Now it's going to modulate more freely all the time. There you go, you can see it just oscillating up and down constantly now. Just getting us back to our basic tones so that everything's nice and simple again. Okay, that was all sine waves. That's only one type of LFO. You can see there's lots of different shapes here, and for the most part they're all very straightforward. You can see the sawtooth wave going up the slope and then plummeting down a vertical cliff and then going up another slope. The first 7 waves are all pretty straightforward. They're different shapes, but other than that, nothing remarkable. This one is the sample and hold wave, which basically means every time one complete period of the LFO has completed, it's going to choose a new random variable. So what you're seeing in that graphical representation there is simply an example of what's going to happen, but it's basically random each time the LFO cycles. You can get kind of robotic R2-D2 sort of effects. Chaos wave is truly random and is going to result in something akin to noise. Now, the modified sine wave changes the amplitude of the LFO every cycle. So it's not now the speed that's being changed, it's the amplitude. And as you can see, that's a really good graphical representation of what's going on here. When this LFO is applied to something like pitch, you're going to get a much more random kind of sounding oscillation. I'm just going to re-engage key trigger in order to show you step sequencing. So what we've basically got here is, I've called it step sequencing, but it's a step LFO sequencer. We've got 16 individual steps, and in each one of them, each time you click into one of these little zones, you can basically set the amplitude level. But whereas all of these are horizontal lines and seem very straightforward, that's only the beginning of the story. Because if we click in the little numbered boxes, we engage the LFO wave shape editor. And now for each one of these different modulation slots, you can pick the wave type that you want to occur in that individual slot. Now this is one of the best LFOs I've ever seen. This is an absolutely fabulous design. Because what we've basically got now is the ability to draw really complex LFO shapes very quickly. Each one of these steps is going to do that thing to whatever LFO destination we're mapped to. Obviously, we're assigned to pitch at the moment. Just press the little cross to close the editor down. I'll just speed it up a bit. So it's just so easy to dial these things in. If you press 0, it basically gets you from the previous section to the next section as simply as possible. But as you can see in this example here, it doesn't draw from the end of the last zone, it draws from the beginning of the current one. In other words, this modulation level is currently set to that axis point there. If I make it horizontal, it makes it much easier to see what's going on. So this is the point from which it draws to there. So if I completely go ham and draw a ridiculous wave shape and then speed it up a bit, this is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, love it. Okay, so that's the visual editor done. Over in the Pro Edit screen, lots of these options have already been covered because the visual editor is pretty robust in this case, but there are a few options over here that aren't available in the visual editor. Let's just cover them off. I'm actually just going to reset my tone because we messed with that LFO so badly. Okay, that'll do us. Rate detune is the first option that the Pro Edit screen has that the visual editor doesn't. And it's basically going to very slightly modulate the LFO every time I press a key. So you're just going to get little inherent offsets in the modulation itself. So if I press a single key and hold it down, you're going to get a completely constant LFO. If I let the key go and then press it again, you're going to get a different LFO. Again, I'll let that die down. So it's modulating slightly around the central axis. It's not selecting from the entire range of possible LFO rates. It's just to introduce a little bit of randomness. Delay time KF stands for key follow, and this is basically going to make, well, if I set a positive value for this, it's going to make the delay time shorter for higher notes. So let's get a basic delay time up and running. Okay, and I'm actually going to leave it brutal. So we go from no modulation whatsoever to extreme LFO. Now, if I set the key follow on, play a low note. Took about 3 or 4 seconds. Now press a high note. Kicked off almost immediately. If you set negative levels, it basically flips that logic. This is another pretty good illustration of something that's mimicking the real world. That's generally what happens when you play the lower notes. You do tend to give a longer period of time before you begin the modulation, maybe the vibrato or the tremolo. So it's a good way to map or to model that real world effect that you might be after. There are 4 different fade modes, and the default is on in, and by far the most common. This is where you're going to press a note, there's going to be a delay, then there's going to be a fade in, and then you're going to get your standard end of play low frequency oscillation. But you can have all of this triggering off the release note, the release key instead. So the 2 outs are exactly the same operation. So off in means we're going to get exactly the same kind of concept, but now it's going to trigger off the release of the note. So you're going to get a completely static oscillation for the entire time the note is held, and as soon as you let go, then you're going to have your delay time, and then your fade in time down to 0. There's a decent graphical representation of this in the document. This describes it as well as I can. So on in is the regular one, that's what you've seen. On out is still triggering off note on, that's what the on section means, but now you get a static LFO the moment you click the note, and the delay time determines how long the static LFO goes for before the fade time takes you down to 0. So it's basically flipped all of the logic. Off in is the most useless in my opinion. It's the kind of the most counterintuitive combination, which mathematically is permissible, but when you would ever wait for the release note, then have an additional delay time before you fade into an oscillation, I think that's really pretty thin. But for the vast majority of the time, on in is going to be absolutely fine for you. That's the standard default pattern. The final option we have to look at is phase position. There are 4 different options and default is 0, and that basically means where on the curve each time if we press a key and we're in key trigger mode, where do we begin our oscillation from? So this is position 0. Position 1 is at the top of the curve, which means every time I press the curve we're immediately going into a descent. Let's try that. Position 2 is midway down the down curve. Position 3 is right at the bottom. So that's another really easy one to demonstrate. And then we cycle around back to position 0, which is where we started from. Now just bear in mind, everything that we've talked about today has been in the context of pitch or amplitude, but this LFO can be assigned to almost every control in the synthesizer. So as we go on to look at different modules, just bear in mind that we've got this flexible modulation engine that can be mapped to pretty much anything. And as we go through the various modules, we'll be able to see examples of that and get to understand just how flexible and powerful the LFO engine is. Thanks very much for watching this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button if you did. I'll see you for the next one.